What is a merchant afraid of most? It's not losing money. It's finding himself standing with a group of brothers when he knows the path ahead is a dead end. What is a woman afraid of most? It's not being hunted down. It's her father thrusting the fate of an entire nation into her hands before he dies. If a weapon could save your country, yet also blow countless people to dust, would you choose to build it or destroy it with your own hands? Even more ironic is that what truly forced them onto the battlefield was not hatred, but a seemingly ordinary business deal gone wrong. Seolju was originally just the head of a merchant group, shrewd with his words, calculating in his mind, and constantly fretting over how to sell goods, how to repay debts, and how his brothers could survive. That day, his merchant group was waiting to close a big deal with Ming merchants. Fabric, paper, and goods had all been staked on it, but the cargo was hijacked at Yongsan Pass, and the Ming merchants never showed up. Just like that, the entire merchant group felt as if they were being choked. There were only 10 days left until the debt was due, and while the brothers were running around in a panic, Seolju had to pretend to be calm. Because he knew that in business, the thing to fear most is not a loss, but everyone staring at you, waiting for you to make the call. Just then, Chang Kang, the commander of the royal guards, came knocking. This man, known as the greatest swordsman in Joseon, didn't offer much explanation, only requesting that Seolju shelter someone at midnight without anyone finding out. Seolju, of course, didn't want any trouble. A merchant understands risk better than anyone, but since Chang Kang had asked, he took the person in. The visitor's name was Hong Ri. She didn't look like a fugitive, nor did she look like an ordinary woman. She was calm, stubborn, and her eyes held a piercing, steely resolve. Seolju couldn't get her to reveal her origins, and it seemed she was being hunted by a group of people. It turned out that Hong Ri's father, Ga Song, had been pushed to the edge by the Ming. This old man was no ordinary official. He was the secret director of firearms research and the heart of the Singijeon, Divine Machine Arrow, project. Seeing that their secrets were about to be exposed, he entrusted his mission to his daughter, telling her to become the new director from that moment on, to survive and to finish it. Hong Ri refused to leave, but her father had no other choice. To protect the secret and to allow his daughter to escape, Ga Song chose to take his own life. Hong Ri watched her father die before her eyes, and from that moment on, she was no longer just a daughter. She had become someone carrying the fate of a nation in flight. On the other side, the Ming envoys had arrived in Joseon. Ostensibly, they were there to deliver an imperial decree, but in reality, they were there to humiliate and threaten. In front of the Joseon court, the envoy read the emperor's mandate.
발칙한 조선은 듣거라. 그간 조선은 나의 뜻을 거스르며 매번 나를 업신여겨왔다. 요동지역에 자주 침범하여 국경을 불안케 했으니 그 첫째요. 조공을 모두 쓸모없는 것들만 보내니 이것이 나를 업신여긴 태도로 그 둘째요. 삼천의 여진을 내 허락도 없이 잡아가던 것은 나를 가벼이 여긴 태도로 그 셋째다. 제 딴에 조선이 바다로 둘러싸이고 험한 산으로 막혀있다는 것만 믿고 멋대로 흉악한 짓을 하고 있는 모양이나 내 친히 군사를 이끌고 너희를 징벌치 말게 하라.
The Joseon royal family quickly realized that the envoy was more than just a messenger. Hidden within the Ming delegation were spies and firearms scouts. Their true objective was to prevent Joseon from completing a new weapon. That weapon was called the Singijeon. Seolju still didn't know what he had been dragged into. Hong Ri left without a word, and when she returned, she brought a man with her, begging Seolju to take him in. Then, Hong Ri suddenly insisted on going home to retrieve something important. He took his brothers to accompany her, but as soon as they arrived, they were ambushed. The Ming agents had been waiting there all along. They snatched the Chongtong Dumnok, the secret manual for manufacturing Joseon's firearms and the most critical record of the Singijeon technology. Seolju's brother was nearly killed, and he finally snapped, demanding of Hong Ri,
당신 때문에 내 아우가 죽을 뻔했어. 세상에 어떤 일이 사람 목숨보다 중하단 말이오. 대체 어떤 일이?
Hong Ri did not answer. It wasn't that she was cold-blooded. She knew that some secrets, if spoken aloud, would only lead to more deaths. The stolen Chongtong Dumnok soon fell into the hands of the Ming. When the Ming firearms experts opened it, they immediately realized these were no ordinary rocket blueprints. The dimensions, ratios, and calculations were terrifyingly precise. Even a single inch, a fraction, or a hair's breadth could not be wrong. They finally confirmed that Joseon was truly building a weapon capable of changing the rules of war. Chang Kang no longer held back. He told Seolju that the Ming's business sabotage, the hunt for Hong Ri, and the theft of the manual were all designed to stop the Singijeon from being completed. The palace was crawling with surveillance, and the court could not act openly, so they had to rely on people like Seolju, who were outside the power center. Seolju's first reaction upon hearing this wasn't patriotic fervor, it was refusal.
자네 아버지 일 때문에 아직도 원한이 맺혀 있는가?
Because his own father had once been a gunpowder director who had made firearms for the country. And what happened? Because of his Goryeo lineage and the court's paranoia, his father was executed on charges of treason. For Seolju, the so-called greater good of the nation had once robbed him of his family. Hong Ri looked down on his cowardice. She said he only cared about profit and not the lives of the people. Seolju was stung. He admitted he was just a small-time merchant and didn't have such noble ideals. But fate never waits for you to be ready. Seolju's merchant group was pushed to the brink by the creditor Hong Man. His brothers were detained, his goods were seized, and his business collapsed completely. On the other side, the Ming's hunt grew closer. Seolju finally understood that he thought he could hide behind his trade, but this storm had already engulfed them all. Hong Ri demonstrated a test fire of the Singijeon. Wind direction, distance, angle, everything had to be calculated. That arrow wasn't shot by a bow. It flew by the power of gunpowder itself, and it could explode upon impact. Seolju saw its terrifying power for the first time. If 100 Singijeon were fired at once, no one within the blast radius would survive. It was no ordinary weapon. It would change warfare and give the weak a chance to hold back the cavalry of the strong for the first time. Seolju remained a merchant on the surface. He talked to Chang Kang about money, terms, contracts, and even demanded more silver. Hong Ri cursed him for his mercenary heart, but he didn't argue back. Because he knew all too well, you can't build a weapon on passion alone. You need people, money, materials, and a group of people willing to bet their lives on it. Thus, an absurd and dangerous workshop began to operate. Bansu and Wucho handled the chores. Inha and Bang Wook were in charge of meals. Pung Yi took care of burning charcoal, and Kyum O was responsible for mobilizing monks to gather saltpeter. Hong Ri taught the group how to distinguish saltpeter. Not all saltpeter could be used. Only the kind with a spicy and bitter taste could detonate.
목탄 한 숟갈, 유황 한 숟갈 반, 염초 7숟갈 반. 자, 모두들 깃털 좀 들고. 자, 이제부터 이걸 잘 섞어야 되는데 잘못하면 마찰 때문에 터질 수가 있다. 그러니까 이 깃털 가볍게 쥐고 이렇게.
This wasn't building a weapon. It was doing handicrafts with the Grim Reaper. Sulfur became another problem. Joseon lacked sulfur, so Hong Ri asked Seolju to find the Japanese merchant, Hasegawa. Hasegawa initially pretended to know nothing, but her attitude changed the moment she saw Hong Ri. It turned out Ga Song had saved her life once. She owed Ga Song a debt of gratitude, so she was willing to help Hong Ri.
근데 그 유황값은 이 얼마를 드려야?
무슨 말씀을? 유황값은 됐습니다. 잠시만.
She didn't want money. She only asked Seolju to find her a copy of the Diamond Sutra to fulfill the wish of a deceased friend. In this film, many people act not because of orders, but because of kindness, because of brothers, because of debts, or because they refuse to kneel anymore. The Ming were not idle either. The more they investigated, the more alarmed they became. The Singijeon wasn't just a rocket. It was a multi-barrel rocket launcher, capable of firing 100 rounds simultaneously. Upon receiving the news, the Ming emperor immediately ordered the mobilization of troops. In the eyes of a great power, the greatest crime of a small nation is not resistance, but the possession of the ability to resist. In the workshop, the tests for the Singijeon failed again and again. Medium-sized Singijeon were barely manageable, but the large ones were not. It wasn't just about doubling the gunpowder. They had to contain iron shards, require sufficient propellant, and ensure the gunpowder was packed tightly without leaving any air pockets. If there was the slightest error, the rocket wouldn't fly. It would blow up their own people first. An accident finally happened. Wu Cho nearly died in a test. He wept, saying he still wanted to see his child born. At that moment, everyone's emotions broke.
야, 이 새끼 오줌 갈기듯이 쏴다니는 게 신기전이야? 그게 신기전이야? 씨발, 난 기집애 설쳐서 잘된 꼴을 본 적이 없다. 본 적이 없어.
The words were harsh, but they were also true. Because they weren't mythical heroes. They were a group of ordinary people who felt fear, pain, and regret. Hong Ri finally admitted that if they still had the Chong Tong Dungnok, they might find the answer. The secret manual stolen by the Ming was now at the Taiping Hall. Sol Ju decided to steal it. The brothers knew it was a suicide mission, but they also knew Sol Ju wouldn't go alone. So this group of merchants, cooks, peddlers, and youths broke into the Ming delegation's quarters. The battle at Taiping Hall was perilous. Surrounded by Ming masters and guards, Sol Ju and his group nearly faced total annihilation. Some were captured, some escaped by jumping into the water, and others used their lives to hold off the pursuers. But they still brought the crucial clue back. The problem was finally identified. The failure of the large Singijeon wasn't because of a lack of gunpowder, but because of the launch nozzle. The diameter, capacity, and size of the nozzle had to be precise to the smallest ratio. As the Singijeon neared completion, the pressure from the Ming reached its peak. The envoy pressured Joseon to release the slaves, withdraw troops from the border, surrender the Chong Tong Dungnok, and stop the production of the Singijeon. They also demanded the tribute of court ladies and eunuchs, and even sought to control the fate of the people through marriage decrees. In the court, some were terrified. They argued that Joseon could not fight a war with a great power. Whatever the Ming wanted, they should give. The weapons could stop, the women could be sent, the children could be castrated, as long as the royal family could survive and war could be avoided. But this was the very thing Hong Ri and Sol Ju could not accept. If peace is bought by bowing generation after generation, it is not peace, it is a slow death. A supposed imperial decree soon arrived at the workshop, ordering the arrest of Hong Ri and the cessation of all work. Sol Ju drew his sword in resistance. He knew he wasn't a court official or a general, but he knew better that if this decree were real, the country would already be half dead. Hong Ri chose to step forward. She knew the person the Ming truly wanted was her. If she went, perhaps Sol Ju would live, the brothers would survive, and the workshop could preserve a final shred of hope. Sol Ju wouldn't let her go. The two finally dropped all their pretenses. Hong Ri had been pretending not to be afraid, lonely, or weak, but she finally admitted that because Sol Ju was by her side, she was no longer so afraid. This wasn't just a common love story. It was more like two people pushed to the edge of a cliff, finally admitting, "I want to live, and I want you to live too." But Hong Ri was taken away anyway. The Ming envoys prepared to present her to the emperor. Sol Ju, Chang Kang, and the merchant brothers launched a rescue mission. They were vastly outnumbered, facing thousands of enemies. In the night, by the water, in the forest, among torches and flashing blades, a lopsided ambush began. Sol Ju's side fought with everything they had, yet they couldn't stop the Ming army's advance. There were too many enemies. For every rank they cut down, another surged forward. The Ming general didn't rush to attack, knowing that at daybreak, these people would be crushed. But they didn't know that Sol Ju was also waiting for the dawn. The Singijeon battery was set. Medium-sized Singijeon ready. Aim left. Slight drift to the left. Ignite. Fire. The first round of rockets shot into the sky like a rain of fire crashing into the Ming ranks. The arrows landed, explosions tearing through shields and flesh, and the once orderly formations collapsed instantly. The Ming army discovered for the first time that they were not facing a group of desperate outlaws, but a new kind of warfare they could not comprehend. However, the battle did not end immediately. Remnant troops were closing in, and Hong Ri was still in the hands of the enemy. The Ming envoy panicked, ordering the woman to be killed, but the general held him back, as she was intended for the emperor. In that brief moment of hesitation, Seolju's side found their final opportunity. The large Singijeon was pushed to the front. It had never been fired in actual combat. Ignite. At that moment, the large Singijeon roared into the sky. It was no longer numbers on a blueprint, no longer a failure in the workshop, no longer an unfinished, dying wish of Ga Song. It flew across the battlefield, carrying all their fear, rage, sacrifice, and hope, and crashed into the enemy ranks. The explosions swallowed everything. The Ming army was thoroughly defeated. That delegation, which had once been so arrogant in delivering decrees and forcing Joseon to kneel, finally understood one thing. A small nation may be threatened, but its right to resist cannot be stripped away forever. After the battle, the Ming's attitude changed immediately. They framed the border conflict as a misunderstanding caused by treacherous officials, sent envoys to ease tensions, and returned the previously demanded eunuchs and court ladies. This is the most realistic face of power. When you are weak, they want even your children. Only when you gain the ability to make them bleed do they suddenly remember the meaning of peace. The king of Joseon summoned Seolju and Hong Ri. He invited them to manage the armory and continue to serve the country. But Seolju and Hong Ri refused. They had saved the country once, but they didn't want to give the rest of their lives to war. The king of Joseon did not get angry. Instead, he knelt before them. The officials were in a panic, but he said that he had once knelt before the envoys of an enemy state. So why couldn't he kneel before the national heroes of his own people? This act of kneeling was not for the merchant, nor for the woman, but for those ignored by history. It was for the deceased Ga Song, for Wu Cho who nearly died in the tests, for the brothers who risked their lives at Taiping Hall, and for all those without names who held up the backbone of the nation. In the end, Seolju returned to the market. He was still the same merchant who would haggle over prices, and his eyes would still light up when he saw the Ming merchants' offers. But when someone wanted to buy his fireworks, he couldn't bear to let them go. Because those were not goods. They were the gift he used to propose to Hong Ri. The rockets once used to kill enemies turned into fireworks in the night sky. What they burst into was no longer flesh and blood, but the light of a nation that had finally stood up straight. The true beauty of the divine weapon is not just the war scenes of rockets firing in unison, but how it placed a group of ordinary people at the center of history. A merchant can fear death. A woman can be fragile, a monk can be greedy, and brothers can complain. But when everyone was pushed to the final step, they still chose to bet their lives on it.